Hi guys, tonight I have a fascinating story for you that will take us back in time to the Middle Ages, a world so different from ours, yet full of strange and intriguing details about how people lived and, most importantly, what they ate and how they got their food. This story will explore the daily lives of peasants, the lavish feasts of nobles, the odd eating habits, the struggles during famines, and the role of religion in shaping medieval diets. Before you get comfortable and rest, maybe you want to hit the like button for this video, and if you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Also, tell us in the comments what time it is where you are right now, and from which part of the world you're watching, so we can see where our viewers come from the most. Now, let's dive into the story. Imagine a world without supermarkets, refrigerators, or even reliable roads to bring food from faraway places. The Middle Ages, roughly spanning from the 5th to the 15th century, was a time when most people lived in small villages or on manors, working the land to survive. Life was harsh, and food was not something to take for granted. The way people ate was deeply connected to their social status, the seasons, and the land they lived on. For the vast majority, food was simple, repetitive, and often scarce. But for the wealthy, food was a symbol of power and prestige, with elaborate banquets showcasing exotic spices and rare ingredients. The peasants, who made up the bulk of the population, relied heavily on what they could grow or gather themselves. Their diet was mostly vegetarian, centered around grains like barley, rye, and oats, which they ground into coarse flour to bake dark, dense bread. This bread was the staple of their meals, often accompanied by pottage, a thick, stew-like dish made from vegetables, legumes, and sometimes bits of meat or fish if they were lucky. Meat was a luxury for peasants, usually reserved for special occasions or when they could hunt small game or catch fish from nearby rivers.
Farming was the backbone of medieval life, but it was far from easy. The tools were primitive, and the knowledge of crop rotation and soil management was limited. Most peasants worked long hours in the fields, planting and harvesting crops by hand. They also kept a few animals like chickens, pigs, or goats, which provided eggs, milk, and occasional meat. Hunting was generally forbidden for peasants, as forests were often reserved for the nobility, but some risked punishment to catch rabbits or birds. The nobility, on the other hand, enjoyed a very different culinary world. Their meals were grand affairs, often lasting for hours and featuring multiple courses. They ate a variety of meats, including beef, pork, venison, and game birds like pheasants and swans. Fish was also important, especially on fasting days when meat was prohibited. The wealthy had access to spices like pepper, cinnamon, and cloves, imported from faraway lands through complex trade routes. These spices were not just for flavor, but also a status symbol, showing off their wealth and connections. Cooking methods varied, with roasting over open fires being common for large cuts of meat, while boiling and baking were also used. The kitchens of castles and manors were busy places, staffed by cooks who prepared elaborate dishes. Food presentation was important, and sometimes dishes were decorated with gold leaf or shaped into fantastic forms to impress guests. But medieval food was not just about what was eaten, it was also about strange customs and beliefs. For example, people often ate with their hands, using bread as a utensil to scoop up food. It was common to share a communal bowl, and hygiene standards were very different from today. Some foods were believed to have medicinal properties, and others were avoided due to superstition. Fermented foods like sauerkraut and pickled vegetables were common, helping preserve food through the winter months.
Markets and fairs were vital for obtaining food beyond what one could grow or hunt. Weekly markets allowed peasants and townsfolk to buy and sell goods, including fresh produce, meat, and fish. Trade routes connected Europe to Asia and Africa, bringing exotic spices, sugar, and dried fruits. However, access to these goods was limited by wealth and geography. Life in the Middle Ages was also marked by frequent food shortages and famines. Bad weather, war, and disease could destroy crops and disrupt trade, leading to hunger and suffering.
During these times, people had to rely on stored grains, wild plants, or charity from the church. Some turned to desperate measures, and stories of cannibalism or eating unusual animals sometimes appear in historical records. Religion played a significant role in medieval diets. The Christian calendar dictated many fasting days when meat and dairy were forbidden, leading to creative vegetarian dishes. Monasteries were centers of food production and preservation, with monks cultivating gardens, brewing beer, and making cheese. Religious festivals were occasions for special meals, often involving rich foods and sweets. Over the centuries, medieval diets evolved as new foods and techniques spread. The discovery of the New World eventually introduced potatoes, tomatoes, and maize, but these came after the medieval period. Still, the Middle Ages laid the foundation for many European culinary traditions.
In the vast and often unforgiving landscape of the Middle Ages, the question of where food came from was not a trivial one. For the majority of people living during this era, survival depended entirely on the land and the seasons. Unlike today, where food can be shipped across continents in a matter of days, medieval people had to rely on what they could grow, raise, or gather close to home. The sources of food were deeply intertwined with the rhythms of nature, the social order, and the technology available at the time. At the heart of medieval sustenance was agriculture. The vast majority of the population were peasants, working the fields from dawn until dusk. Their lives revolved around the cycles of planting and harvesting, and their diets reflected the crops they could cultivate. The most important crops were grains: barley, rye, oats, and wheat. These grains were the foundation of medieval food, used primarily to make bread, which was the staple of every meal. Bread came in many forms and qualities, depending on the region and the social class of the eater. The poorest peasants often ate a coarse, dark bread made from rye or barley, which was dense and heavy but provided essential calories. Wealthier people enjoyed lighter, whiter bread made from wheat, which was more expensive and considered a luxury. The process of growing these grains was labor-intensive and fraught with challenges. Medieval farmers used simple wooden plows pulled by oxen or horses to till the soil. Crop rotation was practiced to some extent, with fields left fallow or planted with legumes to restore nutrients, but knowledge was limited compared to modern standards. Weather played a crucial role. A bad season could mean a poor harvest, leading to hunger or even famine. The timing of planting and harvesting was critical, and entire communities often worked together during these busy periods.
Once harvested, grains were stored in granaries to protect them from moisture and pests. Milling the grain into flour was another essential step, often done at communal mills powered by water or wind. The flour was then used to bake bread or make pottage, a thick stew that was a common dish among peasants. Pottage could be made from a variety of ingredients: vegetables, legumes like peas and beans, and occasionally bits of meat or fish. It was a versatile and filling meal, eaten daily by those who could not afford more elaborate fare. Animal husbandry was another vital source of food. Most peasants kept small numbers of animals such as chickens, pigs, goats, and sometimes cows or sheep. Chickens provided eggs and meat, pigs were prized for their ability to forage and produce pork, and goats and cows supplied milk, cheese, and butter. However, the consumption of meat was limited for peasants, as animals were often more valuable alive for their ongoing products than as food. Slaughtering an animal was usually reserved for special occasions or when the animal was old or sick. Hunting was generally restricted by law to the nobility, who claimed exclusive rights to the forests and game within them. This meant that peasants were often forbidden from hunting deer, boar, or game birds, and doing so could result in severe punishment. Despite this, some peasants risked poaching small game like rabbits or birds to supplement their diets. Fishing was more accessible, especially for those living near rivers, lakes, or the sea. Freshwater fish such as carp,
Pike and eels were common, and fish was an important part of the diet, especially on religious fasting days when meat was prohibited. The natural environment also provided wild foods that were gathered seasonally. Berries, nuts, wild herbs, mushrooms, and edible roots were collected from forests and fields. These wild foods were essential supplements to the diet, especially during times of scarcity. However, gathering was a risky activity, as forests were often dangerous places, home to wild animals and bandits, and sometimes off-limits due to noble hunting rights. The role of trade in food supply should not be underestimated. While most people relied on local production, markets and fairs allowed for the exchange of goods, including foodstuffs that were not locally available. Salt, for example, was a precious commodity used to preserve meat and fish. Spices, such as pepper, cinnamon, and cloves, were imported from Asia and were highly prized by the wealthy. Sugar, originally a luxury item, began to appear in Europe through trade routes, changing the way people experience sweetness. In towns and cities, food sources were more diverse, but also more expensive. Urban dwellers depended on markets for fresh produce, meat, and fish, which were brought in from the countryside or imported. Bakers, butchers, fishmongers, and greengrocers formed the backbone of medieval food commerce. Guilds regulated the quality and prices of food, ensuring some level of safety and fairness, though food fraud and spoilage were common problems. Preservation of food was a constant concern. Without refrigeration, medieval people relied on methods such as salting, smoking, drying, and pickling to keep food edible for longer periods. Salted pork and fish were staples that could be stored for months, especially important during winter or times of famine. Fermentation was also used to produce foods like sauerkraut and beer, which not only preserved nutrients but also provided essential vitamins. The diet of medieval people was thus a complex interplay of agriculture, animal husbandry, hunting, gathering, trade, and preservation techniques. It was shaped by the environment, social structures, and cultural practices. While the food might seem simple or even harsh by modern standards, it was the product of centuries of adaptation and survival. This intricate system of food production and consumption reveals much about medieval society. It shows the dependence on the land and the seasons, the inequalities between classes, and the ingenuity of people in making the most of what they had. It also highlights the fragility of life in a time when a bad harvest or a disrupted trade route could mean hunger or death. Understanding these sources of food helps us appreciate the daily struggles and triumphs of medieval people. It also sets the stage for exploring the specific diets of different social groups, the cultural significance of food, and the strange and fascinating customs that surrounded eating in the Middle Ages. The daily life of a peasant in the Middle Ages was a constant struggle against the elements, the land, and scarcity. Their food, simple as it may seem to us now, was the cornerstone of their survival and shaped by the harsh realities of their world. Unlike the lavish feasts of the nobility, the peasant's diet was humble, repetitive, and heavily dependent on what the earth could provide. Yet, within this simplicity lay a complex relationship between people, nature, and tradition. At the heart of the peasant's diet was bread. Bread was not just food, it was life itself. For most peasants, bread was made from rye or barley, grains that could grow in poorer soils and harsher climates where wheat struggled to thrive. This bread was dark, dense, and often coarse, far from the soft white loaves we know today. It was baked in communal ovens or simple clay ovens attached to their homes. The process of making bread was laborious, harvesting the grain, threshing it to separate the kernels, grinding it into flour using hand mills or water-powered mills, and finally baking it. Bread was eaten at every meal, often used as a utensil to scoop up other foods or soak up broths.
Alongside bread, peasants commonly ate pottage, a thick, hearty stew that was the centerpiece of their meals. Pottage was made by boiling whatever ingredients were available: grains, vegetables, legumes, and sometimes small amounts of meat or fish. It was a flexible dish, changing with the seasons and the farmer's luck. In spring and summer, fresh greens like nettles, leeks, onions, and wild herbs were added. In autumn, root vegetables such as turnips, carrots, and parsnips became staples. During winter, dried peas or beans were soaked and cooked slowly to create a nourishing meal. Pottage was often cooked in large pots over an open fire, simmering for hours to extract every bit of flavor and nutrition.
Meat was a rare luxury for peasants. Most families could not afford to slaughter their animals regularly, as livestock were valuable assets for milk, wool, or labor. Pigs were sometimes raised because they could forage in the forest and were easier to feed, but even pork was usually reserved for special occasions like festivals or harvest celebrations. Chickens provided eggs and occasional meat, but again, these were not everyday foods. Hunting was forbidden for peasants, and poaching was dangerous, punishable by fines or imprisonment. Fish was more accessible, especially for those near rivers or the coast, but fresh fish was seasonal and often salted or smoked to last through the winter. Vegetables and legumes were essential to the peasant diet. Cabbage, onions, garlic, leeks, and beans were common garden crops. These plants were hardy and could grow in the less fertile soils of peasant plots. Legumes like peas and broad beans were particularly important because they provided protein and helped replenish the soil with nitrogen. Wild plants and herbs were also gathered from the surrounding countryside. Nettles, dandelions, wild garlic, and sorrel were eaten fresh or cooked, adding variety and nutrients to the diet. Mushrooms, berries, and nuts were seasonal treats, though peasants had to be cautious, as some wild mushrooms were poisonous. Dairy products played a modest role in the peasant diet. Goats and cows provided milk, which was often turned into cheese or butter. Cheese was a valuable source of protein and fat, especially during winter months when fresh food was scarce. Butter was used sparingly as it was difficult to produce in large quantities. Milk was sometimes consumed fresh, but was more commonly processed to extend its shelf life.
The peasant's diet was not only shaped by availability, but also by the seasons. Spring brought fresh greens and the promise of new growth. Summer was a time of abundance, with fruits, vegetables, and fresh grains. Autumn was the critical harvest season, when crops were gathered and stored for the winter. Winter was the hardest time, with limited fresh food and reliance on preserved goods like salted meat, dried legumes, and root vegetables. The cycle of the seasons dictated not only what peasants ate, but also when and how they ate it. Food preparation was simple, but required skill and patience. Cooking was done over open hearths or in simple clay ovens. Pots and pans were made of clay or iron, and utensils were basic. Meals were communal, often eaten in the main room of the house, with family members sharing from common dishes. Hygiene standards were very different from today. Washing hands before meals was not always practiced, and food could be contaminated easily. Despite these challenges, the peasant diet was surprisingly nutritious, providing enough energy for the hard physical labor required by farming. Fasting and religious observances also influenced what peasants ate. The medieval church imposed numerous fasting days throughout the year, during which meat, dairy, and sometimes fish were forbidden. On these days, peasants relied heavily on vegetables, legumes, and grains. This religious calendar shaped the rhythm of eating and encouraged the development of vegetarian dishes and fish recipes. Despite the hardships, peasants found ways to enjoy their food and celebrate through it. Festivals and holy days were occasions for special meals,
often involving the slaughter of an animal or the baking of sweetbreads and cakes. These moments of feasting were important social events, strengthening community bonds and providing relief from the daily grind. Stories from the period reveal some of the strange and resourceful ways peasants dealt with food scarcity. During famines, people resorted to eating unusual plants, tree bark, or even animals not normally considered food. There are accounts of peasants boiling leather to extract nutrients or making bread from acorns and other wild nuts. These desperate measures highlight the precariousness of medieval peasant life and their resilience in the face of adversity. In summary, the daily food of peasants in the Middle Ages was a reflection of their environment, social status, and cultural practices. It was simple, repetitive, and often monotonous, but it sustained millions through centuries of hardship. The reliance on bread, pottage, vegetables, and occasional meat or fish created a diet that was both a necessity and a tradition, passed down through generations. Understanding this diet gives us a window into the lives of those who formed the backbone of medieval society, whose labor fed kingdoms and shaped history. In stark contrast to the humble fare of the peasants, the diet of the nobility and royalty in the Middle Ages was a world apart, lavish, diverse, and often extravagant. For the lords, ladies, and kings who ruled the land, food was not merely sustenance, it was a symbol of power, wealth, and prestige. The grand feasts held in castles and great halls were as much about displaying status as they were about satisfying hunger. These meals were carefully orchestrated events, filled with exotic ingredients, elaborate preparations, and theatrical presentations that dazzled guests and reinforced social hierarchies. The foundation of noble cuisine was meat. Unlike peasants who ate meat sparingly, the aristocracy consumed it in abundance. Beef, pork, lamb, and venison were staples, often served in large quantities during banquets. Game birds, such as pheasants, swans, peacocks, and even cranes, were prized delicacies, hunted in the vast forests reserved for the nobility. Hunting was not only a source of food, but also a favored pastime and a demonstration of skill and bravery. The spoils of the hunt were brought to the kitchens to be transformed into sumptuous dishes. Fish also held a prominent place on noble tables, especially given the religious restrictions on meat consumption during fasting days. Freshwater fish like carp, pike, and trout were common, as were saltwater varieties such as cod, herring, and shellfish. The wealthy had access to preserved fish, salted, smoked, or dried, that could be stored for long periods. Fish was often prepared with rich sauces and spices, elevating it to a luxurious status. One of the defining features of noble cuisine was the use of spices. Spices such as black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and saffron were imported from distant lands through complex trade routes that connected Europe to Asia and the Middle East. These spices were incredibly expensive and served as a clear indicator of wealth and sophistication. They were used not only to flavor food, but also to mask the taste of meat that was not entirely fresh, a common problem before refrigeration. The liberal use of spices in sauces, marinades, and even desserts was a hallmark of aristocratic cooking. The preparation of food in noble households was a complex affair, requiring skilled cooks and large kitchens staffed by numerous servants. Roasting was a favored method for large cuts of meat, often done on spits turned by hand or by mechanical devices. Boiling and baking were also common, with pies and pastries filled with meat, fish, or fruit being popular dishes. The presentation of food was an art form. Dishes were sometimes decorated with gold leaf, shaped into elaborate forms, or accompanied by theatrical displays such as live birds released at the table or food arranged to resemble mythical creatures. Noble meals were structured affairs, often consisting of multiple courses served over several hours. The first course might include soups and light dishes, followed by heavier meat courses, and concluding with sweets and fruits.
Wine and ale flowed freely, with wine being the drink of choice for the upper classes. Spiced wines and meads were also popular, adding to the sensory experience of the feast.
The social and political significance of food in noble circles cannot be overstated. Banquets were opportunities to impress allies, intimidate rivals, and display generosity. Hosting a grand feast was a way to assert one's status and influence. The scale of these events could be enormous, with hundreds of guests and dozens of dishes served. The logistics of organizing such feasts were complex, involving careful planning, procurement of rare ingredients, and coordination of kitchen staff. Despite the opulence, noble cuisine was not without its peculiarities and excesses. Some dishes might seem strange or even unappetizing to modern tastes. For example, peacock and swan were sometimes served with their feathers reattached for dramatic effect. Elaborate pies might contain live birds hidden inside, which would fly out when the pie was cut open, entertaining guests. The use of sweet and savory combinations, such as meat cooked with fruits and sugar, was common, reflecting different culinary sensibilities. The influence of medieval noble cuisine extended beyond the dining table. It shaped agricultural practices, trade networks, and even cultural exchanges. The demand for spices and exotic ingredients helped fuel exploration and commerce, connecting Europe to distant parts of the world. The techniques and recipes developed in noble kitchens laid the groundwork for future culinary traditions. In summary, the food of the nobility and royalty in the Middle Ages was a reflection of their power, wealth, and cultural values. It was rich, varied, and often extravagant, designed to impress and satisfy in equal measure. The contrast with the peasant diet highlights the deep social divisions of the time, but also the shared human experience of food as a source of pleasure, identity, and community. The Middle Ages were a time of stark contrasts and peculiar customs, and nowhere was this more evident than in the strange and sometimes bizarre foods people ate, as well as the unusual habits surrounding meals. While the diets of peasants and nobles differed greatly in quality and variety, both groups shared a world where food was not only nourishment, but also deeply entwined with superstition, tradition, and social ritual. Exploring these oddities reveals a fascinating glimpse into medieval life, where the line between necessity, belief, and extravagance often blurred. One of the most striking aspects of medieval food culture was the variety of ingredients that might seem strange or even unappetizing to modern sensibilities. For example, offal, the internal organs of animals, was commonly consumed by all classes. While today many people shy away from eating liver, kidneys, or tripe, in the Middle Ages these parts were prized for their flavor and nutritional value. They were often prepared in stews, pies, or roasted dishes. The use of offal was partly practical, ensuring that no part of a slaughtered animal went to waste, but it also reflected a culinary tradition that valued every morsel. Another unusual food was black pudding, a type of blood sausage made from pig's blood mixed with fat and grains. This dish was popular among peasants and nobles alike, providing a rich source of protein and iron. Blood was considered a potent ingredient, sometimes believed to have medicinal properties. Similarly, dishes made from animal brains, tongues, and feet were not uncommon, showcasing a resourcefulness born of necessity and a taste for strong, distinctive flavors.
Medieval cooks also experimented with ingredients that might seem exotic or strange today. For instance, the use of spices extended beyond flavoring meat and fish to include sweet dishes and even beverages. Sugar, though rare and expensive, was used to create elaborate desserts and confections. Honey was a more common sweetener used in mead, cakes, and sauces.
The combination of sweet and savory was a hallmark of medieval cuisine, with dishes mixing fruits like raisins, dates, and figs with meats and spices. This blending of flavors created tastes that modern palates might find unusual but were highly prized at the time. Fermentation played a crucial role in medieval food preservation and flavor. Sauerkraut, pickled vegetables, and fermented dairy products were staples, especially during winter months. Fermented fish sauces, similar to the ancient Roman garum, were used to add umami and saltiness to dishes. These pungent condiments were essential in a time before refrigeration, helping to preserve food and enhance its taste. The habits surrounding eating were as peculiar as the food itself. For example, it was common for people to eat with their hands, using pieces of bread as utensils to scoop up food. Forks were rare and mostly used by the wealthy by the late Middle Ages, but spoons and knives were more common. The communal nature of meals meant that multiple people often shared from the same dish or bowl, a practice that would be considered unhygienic today, but was normal then. Medieval table manners were governed by a complex set of social rules and customs. For instance, it was considered polite to eat quietly and avoid making loud noises while chewing. Burping or blowing one's nose at the table was frowned upon, though some sources suggest that burping could be seen as a compliment to the cook in certain contexts. The use of napkins was limited, and washing hands before and after meals was not always practiced, contributing to the spread of disease.
One of the more curious customs was the use of trencher bread, thick slices of stale bread used as plates. After the meal, these bread plates, soaked with sauces and juices, were often eaten by the diners or given to the poor. This practice was practical and economical, reducing waste and providing an additional source of food. Religious beliefs heavily influenced eating habits and food choices. The medieval church imposed numerous fasting days, during which meat, dairy, and sometimes fish were forbidden. On these days, people ate simpler meals, often based on vegetables, legumes, and grains. The concept of lean days and fat days structured the medieval calendar, dictating when rich foods could be consumed. This religious framework shaped not only what people ate, but also how they thought about food, associating certain ingredients with purity or sin. Superstitions and folk beliefs also played a role in medieval food culture. Certain foods were thought to have magical or medicinal properties. For example, garlic was believed to ward off evil spirits and protect against disease. Herbs like rosemary and sage were used not only for flavor, but also for their supposed health benefits. Eating certain animals or parts of animals was thought to transfer their qualities to the eater, such as eating a lion's heart to gain courage, or a stag's antlers to improve strength.
Food could also be a source of fear and suspicion. Contaminated or spoiled food was a common cause of illness. But without modern knowledge of bacteria, people often attributed sickness to curses or divine punishment. This led to rituals and prayers before meals, asking for protection and blessing. In some cases, food was used in magical practices or as part of healing remedies, blending culinary and mystical traditions. The medieval fascination with spectacle extended to food presentation and dining rituals. Banquets often featured elaborate dishes designed to impress and entertain. For example, pies might contain live birds that would fly out when the crust was cut, surprising guests. Food was sometimes shaped into fantastical creatures or arranged in symbolic patterns. These displays were not only culinary but theatrical, reinforcing the host's status and creativity. Despite the extravagance, medieval food was also marked by scarcity and hardship. Famines were frequent, and during these times, people resorted to eating whatever they could find. there are records of people boiling leather to extract nutrients, making bread from acorns or tree bark, and even consuming animals not normally considered food, such as dogs or cats. These desperate measures highlight the precariousness of medieval life and the lengths to which people would go to survive.
In towns and cities, the variety of food and eating habits was influenced by trade and cultural exchange. Spices, sugar, and exotic fruits arrived from distant lands, introducing new flavors and ingredients. Markets bustled with vendors selling fresh produce, meats, fish, and prepared foods. Taverns and inns offered meals to travelers and locals, often featuring hearty stews, bread, and ale. Street food was common, with vendors selling pies, pastries, and roasted meats. The role of women in food preparation was central. In peasant households, women managed the kitchen, tending the fire, preparing meals, and preserving food. In noble households, women oversaw the kitchens and sometimes participated in cooking, though much of the labor was done by specialized cooks and servants. Recipes and culinary knowledge were passed down through generations, often orally or in handwritten manuscripts. In conclusion, the strange foods and unusual eating habits of the Middle Ages reflect a world where food was much more than mere sustenance. It was a source of identity, power, belief, and survival. The peculiar ingredients, cooking methods, and dining customs reveal a society deeply connected to its environment, its faith, and its social structures. Understanding these oddities helps us appreciate the richness and complexity of medieval life, reminding us that even in the most challenging times, people found ways to nourish their bodies and souls in ways both practical and imaginative.
In the Middle Ages, obtaining food was a complex and often challenging process that shaped every aspect of daily life. Unlike today's world, where food is readily available in supermarkets and restaurants, medieval people had to rely on a combination of farming, hunting, gathering, fishing, and trade to feed themselves and their families. The methods they used to secure food were deeply influenced by social status, geography, climate, and the political and economic systems of the time. For the vast majority of the population, the peasants, food was produced locally, on the land they worked. The feudal system structured medieval society, with peasants living on manors owned by lords. These peasants, often called serfs, were bound to the land and required to provide labor, produce, or rent to their lord in exchange for protection and the right to cultivate small plots for their own use. Their survival depended on the success of their crops and livestock, which they tended with limited tools and knowledge. Agriculture was the primary means of obtaining food. Peasants grew grains such as barley, rye, oats, and wheat, which were the staples of their diet. They also cultivated vegetables like onions, leeks, cabbage, and beans. The work was backbreaking and seasonal, with planting in the spring, tending through the summer, and harvesting in the autumn. The success of these crops was never guaranteed. Bad weather, pests, or disease could devastate fields and lead to famine.
Livestock was another crucial source of food. Peasants raised animals such as pigs, chickens, goats, and cows, which provided meat, eggs, milk, and dairy products. However, animals were valuable assets, and slaughtering them was often reserved for special occasions or when the animal was no longer productive. Pigs were particularly important because they could forage in the forest and convert waste into meat. Goats and cows supplied milk, which was turned into cheese and butter, essential for nutrition during the winter months. Hunting was generally the privilege of the nobility who owned the forests and game rights. Peasants were forbidden from hunting most game, and poaching was punishable by law. Despite this, some peasants risked fines or imprisonment to hunt rabbits, birds, or other small animals to supplement their diets. Hunting was not only a source of food, but also a symbol of status and power for the aristocracy.
Lords and knights spent considerable time and resources organizing hunts, which were both practical and recreational. Fishing was an important food source, especially for communities near rivers, lakes, or the sea. Freshwater fish such as carp, pike, and eels were common, as were saltwater fish like cod and herring. Fish was especially important during religious fasting days when meat was prohibited. Fishing methods ranged from simple nets and traps to more organized commercial fishing in coastal towns. Salted and smoked fish were preserved for long-term storage and trade.
Markets and fairs played a vital role in the medieval food supply chain. Weekly markets in towns and villages allowed peasants and townsfolk to buy and sell foodstuffs, including fresh produce, meat, fish, and dairy products. These markets were hubs of economic and social activity, where farmers, butchers, bakers, and fishmongers gathered. Fairs, held less frequently but on a larger scale, attracted merchants from distant regions, bringing exotic goods such as spices, sugar, dried fruits, and wine. Trade networks connected Europe to Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, facilitating the import of luxury food items. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg were highly prized and expensive, often reserved for the wealthy. Sugar, originally a rare and costly commodity, began to appear more frequently in European kitchens, changing the way people experience sweetness. These trade routes were complex and dangerous, involving caravans, ships, and multiple intermediaries, but they were essential for the flow of goods. Food preservation was a constant concern, as fresh food was perishable and refrigeration did not exist. Medieval people developed various methods to extend the shelf life of their food. Salting was widely used for meat and fish, drawing out moisture and inhibiting bacterial growth. Smoking added flavor and further preserved food. Drying was another common technique, especially for fruits, herbs, and grains. Pickling vegetables in vinegar or brine allowed for storage through the winter. Fermentation produced foods like sauerkraut and beverages such as beer and mead, which were staples in many households.
The church also played a significant role in food production and distribution. Monasteries were centers of agricultural innovation, managing large estates and experimenting with crop rotation, animal husbandry, and food preservation. Monks brewed beer, made cheese, and cultivated gardens that supplied both the monastery and the local community. The church provided charity to the poor, distributing food during times of famine or hardship, reinforcing its social and spiritual authority. Seasonality dictated much of medieval food availability. Fresh fruits and vegetables were only available during certain months, while preserved foods sustained people through the harsh winters. The planting and harvesting cycles were critical, and communities often came together to help each other during these busy times. Festivals and religious holidays were often timed to coincide with agricultural milestones, celebrating the bounty of the land. In towns and cities, food procurement was more commercialized. Urban residents depended on markets and specialized vendors for their food. Bakers, butchers, fishmongers, and greengrocers formed guilds that regulated quality and prices. Food safety was a concern, as spoilage and contamination were common. Authorities sometimes inspected markets and punished fraud or adulteration, but enforcement was inconsistent.
The logistics of food supply were challenging. Roads were often poor, making transportation slow and difficult. Perishable goods had to be consumed quickly or preserved. Seasonal shortages and bad harvests could lead to price spikes and famine. The Black Death in the 14th century disrupted food production and labor, causing further hardship. Despite these challenges, medieval people developed a resilient and adaptive system for obtaining food. Their methods reflected a deep connection to the land, community cooperation, and a growing network of trade and commerce. Food was not just a necessity, but a central part of social life, economy, and culture.
Understanding how people obtained their food in the Middle Ages reveals much about their daily struggles and achievements. It shows a world where survival depended on hard work, knowledge passed through generations, and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. It also highlights the beginnings of a more interconnected world, where local production met global trade, setting the stage for the transformations to come in later centuries.
The Middle Ages were marked not only by the rhythms of planting and harvest, but also by the harsh realities of food crises and famines that could devastate entire regions and alter the course of history. For the vast majority of medieval people, whose lives depended on the land and its bounty, a failed harvest or a disrupted supply chain was a matter of life and death. Famines were frequent and often catastrophic, exposing the fragility of medieval food systems and the vulnerability of societies built on agriculture. One of the most infamous famines of the medieval period was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. This crisis began with a series of unusually heavy rains and cold weather that destroyed crops across much of northern Europe. Fields became waterlogged, seeds rotted in the ground, and harvests failed. The famine spread rapidly, affecting England, France, the Low Countries, and parts of Germany and Scandinavia. Food shortages led to soaring prices, widespread hunger, and increased mortality. Contemporary accounts describe scenes of desperation, people scavenging for roots and wild plants, selling their possessions for food, and even resorting to cannibalism in extreme cases. The causes of such famines were complex and multifaceted. Climate played a significant role. The medieval period experienced fluctuations in weather patterns, including the onset of the Little Ice Age in the 14th century, which brought colder and wetter conditions. These changes shortened growing seasons and increased the risk of crop failure. Agricultural techniques, while improving slowly, were still limited, and farmers had little ability to mitigate the effects of bad weather.
Social and economic factors also contributed to food crises. The feudal system placed heavy demands on peasants, who had to give a portion of their produce to their lords as rent or tax. This left them with less food for themselves, making them more vulnerable to shortages. Additionally, wars and conflicts disrupted farming and trade, destroying fields and blocking supply routes. The 100 Years' War between England and France, for example, caused widespread devastation and food insecurity in affected regions. During famines, the social fabric was strained to breaking point. Starvation led to increased mortality, especially among children and the elderly. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making populations more susceptible to disease. The Great Famine preceded the Black Death, which would later decimate Europe's population, and some historians argue that the weakened state of the population contributed to the plague's severity. People's responses to famine varied. Some communities organized relief efforts, distributing food to the poor through churches and monasteries. Charitable institutions played a crucial role in providing aid, though their resources were often overwhelmed. Others resorted to desperate measures, eating unconventional or forbidden foods, such as tree bark, grass, or even animals not normally consumed. There are grim accounts of people boiling leather or consuming the dead. Such acts highlight the extreme conditions and the will to survive.
Famine also had profound social and political consequences. Food shortages could lead to unrest, riots, and rebellion. Peasants, already burdened by taxes and labor obligations, sometimes revolted against their lords or authorities they blamed for their suffering. These uprisings, while often suppressed, signaled the deep tensions within medieval society and the central importance of food security. The Church's role during famines was significant but complex. On one hand, religious institutions provided charity and comfort, organizing food distribution and caring for the sick. On the other hand, some viewed famine as divine punishment for sin, encouraging repentance and moral reform. Religious festivals and fasting practices sometimes continued despite hardship, reflecting the deep intertwining of faith and daily life. In addition to famines caused by natural and social factors, medieval Europe faced periodic food shortages due to plague outbreaks, warfare, and economic disruption. The Black Death of the mid-13th century, which killed an estimated one-third of Europe's population, caused massive labor shortages that affected food production. Fields went untended and harvests declined, leading to localized food crises even after the plague subsided. Despite these challenges, medieval societies showed resilience. Agricultural innovations, such as improved plows, better crop rotation, and the introduction of new crops, gradually increased food production. Trade networks expanded, bringing in food from other regions to alleviate shortages. Communities developed systems of mutual aid and charity to support the vulnerable. The history of famines in the Middle Ages is a stark reminder of the precariousness of life in a pre-industrial world. It reveals how closely tied people were to the land and the environment, and how social structures could both mitigate and exacerbate suffering. Understanding these crises helps us appreciate the advances in agriculture, transportation, and social welfare that have transformed food security in the modern era.
Religion was a central pillar of medieval life, influencing not only spiritual beliefs, but also daily routines, social structures, and even what people ate. In the Middle Ages, the Christian Church wielded immense power, shaping the moral and cultural fabric of society. One of the most profound ways religion affected everyday life was through its impact on food, dictating what could be eaten, when, and how. The rhythms of the religious calendar, fasting rules, and the practices of monastic communities all intertwined with medieval diets, creating a complex relationship between faith and nourishment. The medieval Christian calendar was filled with numerous feast days, fasts, and holy seasons that structured the year and, by extension, the eating habits of the population. Fasting was a key religious practice, intended as a form of penance, spiritual discipline, and preparation for holy days. On fasting days, the consumption of meat, dairy, and sometimes fish was prohibited or severely restricted. These days included Lent, the 40 days leading up to Easter, as well as Advent, the period before Christmas, and numerous other fasts scattered throughout the year. During these fasting periods, people turned to alternative sources of nutrition. Vegetables, legumes, grains, and fish became the staples of the diet. The Church's rules on fasting were complex and varied by region and time, but the general principle was to abstain from luxury foods, especially meat. Fish was often allowed, leading to the development of a rich tradition of fish dishes and preservation methods, such as salting and smoking. This religious framework not only influenced what people ate, but also encouraged culinary creativity, as cooks sought to prepare satisfying meals within the constraints of fasting.
Monastic communities played a crucial role in the religious and culinary life of the Middle Ages. Monasteries were centers of learning, agriculture, and food production. Monks and nuns followed strict dietary rules based on religious teachings, which often included fasting and abstinence from meat. Many monasteries cultivated extensive gardens, raised livestock, brewed beer, and produced cheese. Their knowledge of agriculture and food preservation was advanced for the time, and they often served as models for surrounding communities. The monastic diet was simple but nutritious, emphasizing grains, vegetables, legumes, and fish. Meals were eaten in silence or with readings from scripture, reflecting the spiritual focus of the community.
Despite the austerity, monasteries sometimes hosted guests and pilgrims, providing hospitality and food. The culinary practices developed in monasteries influenced broader medieval cuisine, spreading techniques and recipes. Religious festivals were occasions for communal feasting and celebration. Major holidays such as Christmas, Easter, and Saints' Days were marked by special meals that broke the usual fasting rules. These feasts were opportunities for social bonding, display of wealth, and religious observance. Food served at these times were often richer and more varied, including meats, sweets, and spiced dishes. The contrast between fasting and feasting underscored the cyclical nature of medieval life, balancing discipline with celebration.
The symbolism of food in religious practice was profound. Bread, for example, held deep spiritual significance as the body of Christ in the Eucharist. The ritual of communion centered on the sharing of bread and wine, connecting the physical act of eating with spiritual grace. This sacred symbolism elevated the importance of bread in everyday life, reinforcing its status as a staple food. Food was also used in religious rituals and offerings. Blessings over meals, prayers before eating, and the sharing of food with the poor were common practices. The Church encouraged charity and hospitality, seeing the provision of food as a moral duty. Almsgiving often took the form of distributing bread, soup, or other simple foods to the needy, especially during times of famine or hardship. The Church's influence extended to laws and regulations concerning food. It regulated markets, ensured the quality of bread and ale, and set standards for food production. Religious authorities sometimes intervened to prevent fraud or adulteration, protecting consumers and maintaining social order. The intertwining of religious and economic roles highlights the Church's pervasive presence in medieval life. Superstitions and beliefs about food were also shaped by religion. Certain foods were thought to have protective or healing properties, while others were avoided due to associations with sin or impurity. The idea of humours in medieval medicine, influenced by religious and classical thought, linked diet to health and morality. Eating the right foods in the right balance was seen as essential for physical and spiritual well-being.
Despite the strict rules and rituals, medieval people found joy and meaning in food. The communal nature of meals, the sharing of special dishes during festivals, and the care taken in preparation reflected a culture where food was a gift from God and a means of connecting with others. The religious framework provided structure and purpose, turning the act of eating into a sacred experience. In conclusion, religion profoundly shaped the food culture of the Middle Ages. Through fasting, feasting, monastic practices, and symbolic meanings, the Church influenced what people ate, how they prepared food, and the social rituals surrounding meals. This deep connection between faith and food reveals the spiritual dimension of medieval life and the ways in which nourishment was intertwined with belief, community, and identity.
The Middle Ages spanned nearly 1,000 years, a vast period during which food and eating habits evolved significantly. From the earlier medieval period, marked by relative isolation and subsistence farming, to the later centuries, characterized by expanding trade networks and cultural exchanges, the diet of Europeans transformed in response to changing social, economic, and environmental conditions. Understanding this evolution reveals how medieval society adapted to new influences and challenges, laying the groundwork for modern European cuisine. In the early Middle Ages, roughly from the 5th to the 10th century, Europe was emerging from the collapse of the Roman Empire. The political fragmentation and frequent warfare disrupted trade and urban life, leading to a largely rural and self-sufficient population. Food production was primarily local, with peasants growing grains like barley, rye, and oats, and raising livestock for meat, milk, and labor. The diet was simple and repetitive,
focused on survival rather than variety or luxury. During this period, the knowledge of agriculture and food preservation was limited, but gradually improving. Techniques such as crop rotation and animal husbandry were practiced on a small scale. The influence of the church was growing, introducing fasting rules and shaping dietary customs. Monasteries became centers of agricultural innovation, preserving classical knowledge and experimenting with new crops and methods.
As Europe moved into the High Middle Ages, from the 11th to the 13th centuries, significant changes began to take place. Population growth, relative political stability, and economic expansion fueled increased agricultural production and urbanization. Markets and towns grew, creating demand for a wider variety of foods and stimulating trade. The Crusades opened new trade routes and introduced Europeans to exotic spices, fruits, and culinary ideas from the Middle East and beyond. This period saw the gradual introduction of new ingredients and cooking techniques. Spices such as pepper, cinnamon, and cloves became more accessible to the wealthy, transforming noble cuisine. Sugar, initially a rare luxury, began to appear in desserts and sweetened dishes. The cultivation of vineyards expanded, increasing wine production and consumption. The use of refined wheat flour improved bread quality, especially among the upper classes. The High Middle Ages also witnessed the rise of guilds and professional cooks who codified recipes and culinary practices. Cookbooks began to be written, preserving knowledge and spreading culinary trends. Banquets and feasts became more elaborate, reflecting the growing wealth and sophistication of the nobility. At the same time, peasants continued to rely on traditional staples but benefited from improved agricultural techniques and market access.
The late Middle Ages, from the 14th to the 15th centuries, were marked by both challenges and innovations. The Black Death devastated Europe's population, causing labor shortages and social upheaval. These changes affected food production and distribution, leading to shifts in diet and consumption patterns. With fewer workers, some lands were converted from grain cultivation to pasture, increasing meat and dairy availability. Trade networks expanded further, bringing new foods and ideas from distant lands. The introduction of new crops from the Americas, such as maize, potatoes, and tomatoes, would come slightly later, but the groundwork for global exchange was laid during this time. The demand for spices and luxury foods continued to grow, fueling exploration and commerce. Culinary practices became more refined with increased attention to presentation, flavor combinations, and dining etiquette. The use of sugar and spices in both sweet and savory dishes became widespread among the elite. Cookbooks from this period show a rich variety of recipes, including complex sauces, pastries, and confectionery.
Despite these advances, food insecurity remained a reality for many. Famines, wars, and economic inequality meant that large segments of the population still faced hunger and malnutrition. However, the overall trend was toward greater diversity and sophistication in food and eating habits. The evolution of medieval food was also influenced by cultural exchanges within Europe. The interactions between Christian, Jewish, and Muslim communities, especially in regions like Spain and Sicily, introduced new ingredients, cooking methods, and dietary customs. These influences enriched European cuisine and contributed to its diversity. Religious practices continued to shape eating habits, but there was also a gradual relaxation of some fasting rules and dietary restrictions, reflecting changing social attitudes. The rise of urban centers and the merchant class created new markets and opportunities for food production and consumption.
In rural areas, traditional diets persisted, but peasants gradually incorporated new crops and techniques. The improvement of tools and farming methods increased yields and food availability. The development of better storage facilities and preservation methods helped reduce waste and extend the food supply.
the legacy of medieval food evolution is evident in many aspects of modern European cuisine. Staples like bread, cheese, and pottage have their roots in medieval diets. The use of spices, sugar, and refined cooking techniques laid the foundation for Renaissance and later culinary developments. The social and cultural significance of food as a marker of identity and status also has medieval origins. In conclusion, the evolution of food and eating habits throughout the Middle Ages was a dynamic process shaped by environmental, social, economic, and cultural factors. From the austere diets of early medieval peasants to the elaborate feasts of late medieval nobility, food reflected the changing realities and aspirations of medieval society. This transformation set the stage for the rich culinary traditions that continue to influence us today.
As we reach the end of our journey through the fascinating world of medieval food, it is worth reflecting on what the diets, eating habits, and food procurement methods of the Middle Ages can teach us today. The story of medieval food is not just about what people ate or how they cooked. It is a window into the social structures, cultural values, environmental challenges, and human resilience that shaped an entire era. By understanding the complexities of medieval food culture, we gain insight into the past and find lessons that resonate even in our modern world. One of the most striking lessons from medieval food history is the deep connection between people and their environment. In a time before industrial agriculture, refrigeration, and global supply chains, food was intimately tied to the land, the seasons, and the weather. The success or failure of a harvest could mean the difference between plenty and famine. This dependence fostered a profound respect for nature's rhythms and limitations. Medieval farmers and peasants developed knowledge and techniques to work with the land, from crop rotation to animal husbandry, that allowed them to sustain communities through difficult times. Today, as we face environmental challenges such as climate change, soil degradation, and biodiversity loss, the medieval example reminds us of the importance of sustainable agriculture and local food systems. The resilience of medieval communities, built on adaptation and cooperation, offers inspiration for modern efforts to create food systems that are both productive and environmentally responsible. Another important lesson is the role of social structures in shaping access to food. The stark differences between the diets of peasants and nobility highlight how wealth and power influence what people eat. While nobles enjoyed lavish feasts with exotic spices and rare meats, peasants subsisted on simple bread, pottage, and occasional meat. This inequality was not just about taste, but about survival and health. Food scarcity and famine disproportionately affected the poor, leading to suffering and social unrest. In our contemporary world, food inequality remains a pressing issue. Millions still lack access to sufficient, nutritious food, while others enjoy abundance. The medieval experience underscores the need for equitable food distribution and social policies that ensure everyone can meet their basic nutritional needs. It also shows how food can be a source of social tension, but also a means of community building and solidarity. The influence of religion on medieval food culture teaches us about the power of belief systems to shape daily life. Fasting, feasting, and dietary rules were not merely about nutrition, but about spiritual discipline, identity, and community cohesion. The rituals surrounding food created a shared sense of purpose and belonging, linking the physical act of eating to larger moral and cosmic orders. In modern times, while secularization has changed the role of religion, food remains deeply symbolic. Cultural and religious food traditions continue to provide meaning, mark identity, and bring people together. Understanding the medieval intertwining of faith and food helps us appreciate the enduring significance of food beyond mere sustenance. The creativity and adaptability of medieval cooks also offer valuable insights.
Faced with limited resources, seasonal constraints, and religious restrictions, medieval people developed a rich culinary tradition that balanced practicality with pleasure. The use of spices, fermentation, preservation techniques, and inventive recipes shows a culture that valued flavor, nutrition, and social enjoyment. Today's culinary world, with its fusion cuisines and global ingredients, owes much to these medieval innovations. The medieval palate, open to sweet and savory combinations and complex flavors, challenges modern assumptions about traditional food and invites us to explore diverse tastes and techniques. The communal nature of medieval meals highlights the social importance of food. Eating was often a shared experience, whether in peasant households, noble banquets, or monastic refectories. Meals were occasions for bonding, celebration, and the reinforcement of social hierarchies. The rituals and etiquette surrounding food reflected and shaped relationships within communities.
In our fast-paced, often individualistic society, the medieval emphasis on communal dining reminds us of the value of sharing food as a way to connect with others. Whether through family meals, festivals, or communal tables, food remains a powerful medium for social interaction and cultural expression. The challenges medieval people faced with food preservation and safety also resonate today. Without refrigeration, medieval cooks relied on salting, smoking, drying, and fermentation to keep food edible. These methods not only preserved food, but also created distinctive flavors and textures. However, foodborne illness and spoilage were constant risks, and hygiene standards were very different from modern expectations. Modern food technology has vastly improved safety and shelf life, but concerns about processed foods, additives, and sustainability echo medieval worries about food quality and health. The medieval experience encourages a balanced approach that values both innovation and tradition in food preparation and preservation. Finally, the history of medieval food teaches us about human resilience and ingenuity. Despite frequent famines, wars, and social upheavals, medieval communities found ways to survive, adapt, and even thrive. Their diets, though often simple, sustained millions and supported the growth of complex societies. The stories of resourcefulness, turning acorns into bread, fermenting vegetables for winter, or creating elaborate feasts from limited ingredients, are testaments to human creativity and determination. In a world facing new challenges to food security, from climate change to pandemics, these lessons from the past are more relevant than ever. They remind us that food is not just a commodity, but a vital part of human culture and survival, requiring care, respect, and innovation. In conclusion, the food of the Middle Ages offers us a rich tapestry of history, culture, and human experience. It reveals a world where food was deeply connected to the land, shaped by social and religious forces, and central to community life. By studying medieval food, we gain insight into the challenges and triumphs of the past, and find inspiration for building a more sustainable, equitable, and meaningful food future. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the strange and fascinating world of medieval food. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know what time it is where you are and where you're watching from. We love hearing from our global community. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring history's hidden flavors.